Okay, welcome everyone to ResDecon 313. In this recording, we will look at chapters 16 and 17. This is going to be our last class, and it is going to be a fun class that we will talk about several heuristics and several biases that you want to avoid when you're trying to make a good decision. Okay. So let's start with chapter 16. The title is From Phenomenon to Assessment. Okay, so as you can see in the graph over here, you can see a complex path between observing a phenomenon in the world up until you form a personal assessment of the phenomenon. There are several steps that you go through, maybe unconsciously, but usually for a lot of things. And we will break the process down to each step. And then we will remind you of several biases and errors you want to avoid in each of these steps. Okay. So the things that happen before over here is outside of the scope of the class. We will start with some phenomenon that is happening out there, and then we will focus on this assessment process rather than how this thing come to be. Okay. So let's look at the first step first. It's called information transmission. First, information transmission is such a process that relevant information about the phenomenon may be amplified or attenuated before we absorb them into what we actually observe. For example, people may have selective attention, and rare or unusual events usually make the news. So the news media can be think of an amplifier that may make large of relevant information. Okay. Because of that, there are important information that can be omitted or ignored. The remedy is to be aware of these distortions and omissions and expand sources of information. For example, as you may have already heard before, what makes news are usually rare and uneven events. Like when a dog bites people, it doesn't make news. But when the people bite dogs, it does make news. However, it is more likely in the real world that dogs bite people rather than the other way around. Also, a lot of news stories or media usually choose to report stories that are consistent with their value system or with some accepted public views of behavior. So those news media may report unproportionally the events that are consistent with their worldview. So knowing that, you can expand your source of information to include some medias of the opposite worldview in order to see a fuller picture, make your observables a more representative picture of the real world rather than the amplified or distorted world by the media. The second part of the assessment process is called perception. Perception turns the things you observe into the perceptions. Okay. The problem with that can potentially arise in this process is that our senses are not perfect. Even if something is there objectively in front of your eyes, your senses may distort them into a mispercepted picture of what it actually should be. For example, this is a famous example. Look at the two horizontal lines in this picture. No matter how hard you look at this picture without actually measuring the two horizontal lines, you would always think this bottom horizontal line is longer than this top horizontal line. However, if you actually take a tape to measure these two lines, they are actually equally long. So these optical illusions are a very famous and representative example of faulty senses. Okay, and also, these arrows at the end of the two horizontal lines are what is distorting your judgment on which line is longer. There are other things that can affect the perception. Your worldview may affect perception, and people tend to only to pay attention to information that confirms their worldview. So, as you can say, well, I actually personally experienced this. There is this event that is reported. Me and my friend are reading the exact same news article. However, the conclusions, the perception we draw from the very same article are very different, which reflect our worldview, our political views, or our other views of the world. So what you can do is to, again, be aware of this distortion and try to think about the observed phenomenon or the observed information and try to think outside of your own worldview. Okay. The third process in the assessment, the third step in the assessment is the cognition process. Cognition process turns perceptions into beliefs. Okay. There are several cognitive biases that can cause errors in this cognitive process. One example is wishful thinking. So you form a belief based on what things should be rather than what things actually are. Okay. This is again an effect from your worldview that can bias this cognition step, as it biased your perception step, where it blocks something to fall within your vision. Then, based on the things that fall within your vision, you can still form biased belief. Then there are improper use of heuristics, which we will explain in details for this step. Okay. We will talk about several heuristics. The first one is availability. Availability is talking about the fact that something is easier to think of, seems more likely than something that is not easy to think of. Okay. Information that is more dramatic, more recent, and more imaginable are the things that are easy to think of. And therefore, when you evaluate these events, you can maybe form a belief that it is more likely to happen than those events that are more distant, that are less dramatic, and that are harder to imagine. Here are some examples that I draw from the textbook. So if you think about the likelihood of drowning in a car versus the likelihood of type 2 diabetes, drowning in the car is more imaginable. Well, it is more visual, definitely, than the subtle and long-term symptoms of type 2 diabetes. So because of this difference, drowning in the car is easier to think of versus the contraction of type 2 diabetes is harder to imagine. And because of this, you might think that an average person, is more likely to drown in a car than to die from a type 2 diabetes. However, the fact based on the scientific data is that the later, the type 2 diabetes is more likely. Okay. Another example is thinking about the likelihood of nuclear power plant explosion or the continual exposure to environmental pollution. Again, the former has a more dramatic visual effects. You might have seen explosions of nuclear power plant in movies or in TVs or read that in the newspaper. However, the later is very, very subtle and it is it is less visual than the former one, let's say that. And because of that, you might think this is more likely. However, this is actually more likely, again, according to scientific data that a lot of researchers have gathered. Okay. So to overcome this heuristic, try to think harder about the events that are less dramatic, that are more distant, that are harder to imagine. For example, for the less recent events, you might want to spend some time recall the time where you see it happen. That can bring up the memories, which may overcome the disadvantage of its timing of happening. So that's the first heuristic. It's called availability. The second heuristic is called representativeness. This is actually referring to the error based on ignoring previous experiences. It can lead to incorrect probability estimates, which is what we call belief in this process. And people usually ignore or do not place enough weight on the. So one famous example of this representative heuristic is illustrated in this slide. Suppose that you're looking at a group of people in a building where you have a prior knowledge that 10% of those people are engineers and 90% of those people in the building are lawyers. And you also have some belief of, some kind of belief that an engineer is more likely to wear glasses than compared to a lawyer. So you assign the probability of an engineer wearing glass to be 80%, and you assign probability that a lawyer will wear glasses is 20%. Let's suppose these are very accurate prior knowledge about the people in the building. Now the question is, a person walks out of the building and you noticed that the person is wearing glasses. The question is, how likely do you think the person wearing glasses to be engineer? Okay. Without thorough analysis, people tend to believe that the person wearing glasses is more likely to be an engineer than to be a lawyer. That is, the probability that the person who is wearing the glasses to be engineer should be above 0.5. Okay. However, if you go through the careful analysis steps that we have introduced before, this is what you get. Conditional on that the person is wearing glasses, the probability that he is an engineer is actually only 0.31, which is 31%. Again, we get this number by reverse this tree and go through the 4 steps of tree reversal. So as it turns out, the probability that a person who wears glasses walking out of the building is engineer is less than 0.5, contrary to what people's initial beliefs are that the number should be above 0.5. The reason that this number is below 0.5 is because the prior probability that any person out of that building is an engineer is only 10%. Okay, you should properly account for this low proportion of engineers in that building, which is 10%, when you try to figure out this conditional probability. Okay, so that is a very typical example of representativeness heuristics. As a matter of fact, without going through these thorough steps of tree reversal, even the very advanced, very skilled statisticians might not get this number right. They may still believe it is close to 0.5. Okay. There is also this principle of regression. So things tend to return to the average, even without you doing anything right or wrong. So consider the application to fellowships. Suppose you're the department head and you receive a lot of super high quality applications to some fellowship this year. Okay, that is good. They are exceptionally high quality. Then in the next year, you noticed that the quality of the applications are lower than the previous year, but still good. Then you may jump to wonder, what did I do wrong in the past year that brought down the quality? Well, the fact may well be that you didn't do anything wrong. It's just last year you got a very exceptional draw of applicants, versus this year things are just returning to average. The third heuristic is called anchoring. It is talking about how people form beliefs prematurely based on their initial beliefs. And then when you form a final assessment, when you form a final belief, the initial points that you start building your belief from plays too large a role. A very good example provided in the textbook is about guessing the year of Attilia's defeat. Okay, before a professor asks her students to make the guess, he did the following things. He first asked her students to write the last three digits of their phone numbers. Suppose it's 101. And then he asked the students to add 400 to this number. So in the example that I just used, it will be 101 plus 400, which gives us 501. And then the professor asked the students to write this 501 number down on the paper. Then the professor asked the question, what year was Attila the Hun defeated? Okay, so as you can see, the number that precedes this question has nothing to do with the answer of the question, right? It is your phone number. It is unlikely that your phone number will be relevant to the year that Attila the Hun was defeated. However, from one class with an MBA student, the actual guesses of the year are somewhat tied to the random number that the professor asks them to write down. Okay, so these initial numbers have nothing to do with the answer, yet the answer are tied to it. So when the MBA students have a higher number that were written down, they usually guess a later year for the defeat of Attila. You might want to correct for this bias and try to eliminate or mitigate the effect that your initial belief about it. The fourth heuristic is called implicit conditioning. So when you are asked about the probability, you're assessing it implicitly conditional on the occurrence of some uncertain events. So what you should be given is the unconditional probability of an event happening. However, subconsciously, without realizing it, you may be actually given the probability that is conditioned on things that you believe will happen for certain. For example, suppose you're asked a question, how likely do you think your sales in the next year are going to go up? Then you may give me some number, some belief like 90%. That percentage seems to be high to me. Then I might ask follow-up questions. Did you consider the possibility that there might be a new competitor in the market next year? At that point, you may realize that you didn't account for that possibility. So the 90% probability that the sales will go up is conditioned on the belief that there will be no new competitor in the market. Then after I ask the question, you may further evaluate the probability by considering how likely is there going to be a new competitor in the market. And then in that scenario, your sales may actually go down. Then the eventual probability, unconditional probability that you give me may be adjusted down from the 90% initial judgment. And asking a lot of questions can help you to make this adjustment. The fifth heuristic is called mental accounting. It is referring to the phenomenon that money or other things are labeled and therefore means different things because they are labeled differently. Now imagine you have your bank account and there are $10,000 that you win from the lottery, from a lottery that you bought, and then there are some other money that you earn from your from work, your wages. The $1 from the 10,000 lottery win is actually equal to the $1 that you earned from working. They absolutely are the same in terms of how much you can buy with that $1 or $10 or $100. However, you might treat $1 from the lottery gain differently with the $1 from your wage. You might think $1 is worth more if it comes from your wage than when it comes from the lottery gain. But in reality, $1 is $1. They are absolutely the same. Okay. The last step in the assessment process is called motivation. Okay, so you have some beliefs from the cognition process. Then later, you might want to express your beliefs into statements. However, in this process, you may misrepresent the beliefs that you actually formed from the cognition process. Maybe for the self-interest motivation, you want to gain reward or avoid punishment, you might adjust the belief up or down because of this motivation. And then you may want to make the belief into statement to appear a certain way. Maybe you want to appear stronger, or you want to appear more confident, you want to appear more conformative to the peers that are surrounding you, Or you may want to sell things that you want to, in that case, you might want to blow up the beliefs, or if that belief is about the advantages of the things you're trying to sell. Okay, so from the belief to the statements that you make, the motivations come into factor. Your world will also come into the process to affect, to bias your statements from your beliefs. Okay. As you can see, while these statements are the conclusions or the final product of the assessment process. As you can see, your world wheel comes into a lot of the steps. So in this step, where actual observables are turned into perceptions, your world wheel may lead you to ignore or pay too much attention to certain observables. And when in the cognition process step, where you turn your perceptions into beliefs, your world wheel may also make your beliefs be actually larger or smaller than it actually should be, also in the motivation process. So one common solution to all these biases is to be aware of the effect that your world will may have in the assessment process, and then try to correct for it consciously whenever you can. Next, let's look at Chapter 17, Framing. So before up until Chapter 16, we've already assumed that a frame has been chosen, and it is properly chosen. And what's left to be done is to specify the alternatives given that frame, and then use the logics and methods that we've introduced so far to solve the problem and get the best alternative. However, in this chapter, we're going to take a step back and look at the very precise problem that we have ignored so far, how to choose the right frame, and how important it is to choose the right frame. Now think back to chapter 1. where we looked at what are decisions and the nature of decisions. We've learned so far that decisions are declared. It is not something that arises in nature. Now the question is, how should we go about declaring a decision? And the first step that we've been ignored so far is actually choose the right frame. So we had a metaphor before in the first chapter where the location of the stool is the frame, and that determines what you can and cannot declare as the decision that you want to go with. And then once you declare a decision, it cuts off any other course of action but the one that you decided to follow. You can think of the problem of selecting a frame as a photographer who is deciding what to include and exclude in any picture he or she takes. Okay. This frame affects the final photo quality because anything that are not included in the picture frame cannot be included in the photo. Okay. And the same principle applies to the frame of a decision. You can choose a frame unconsciously, but if you select the wrong frame, you are actually applying all your brain power to solve the wrong problem. Even if you solve the problem correctly, it is still the wrong problem, and you're still cutting off all the possibilities, all the possible actions that you could have taken if you had considered a different frame. Okay, that is why we need to consciously choose the right frame and consciously think about the problem of the frames and revise it as necessary as you go about to think about a decision. Here's a classical example to illustrate how important it is to choose the right frame. 6 people are trying to assess what an elephant is, and each one of them have only part of the elephant in their frame. So someone who can touch the belly of the elephant decides the elephant is like a wall, while the other says elephant is like a spear. And the person who can touch and feel the nose of the elephant says the elephant is like a snake. Well, technically, each person is correct given their limited perspective. However, their perspectives are too limited to characterize the elephant as a whole. So what they should have done is try to decide whether they got the full elephant in their perspective or not. Okay, so they should have taken a step back and think about the best way to assess what this animal is in order to make a full and best judgment. So sometimes we can borrow terms from photography to think about the frame problem. You can think about zooming. Should I zoom out or should I zoom in? And then you can think about after you decide the correct frame or the optimal level of zoom, you can now think about the problem of focusing. Given this current frame, given this current level of zoom, what features should you pay attention to? What features attract your attention? What features not? Okay. Once you have a frame in mind, keep in mind that it can be difficult to switch frames. And often, when we have a frame in mind, we will naturally come to regard the first one that pops up as the right frame, also known as the throne frame. From that point on, it can be very difficult for us to consider using a different frame that might actually better serve our needs. When you are neck deep into the thinking process, you're sort of confined by the throne frame, which makes it hard for you to take a step back. So be careful when you try to commit to the first frame that comes in mind. So remember, in the first couple of chapters, we used the transportation method as a decision problem. And at that point, you might be thinking, which car should I buy? Do I care about fuel efficiency, or do I care about how clean, how environmental friendly the cars are? These are the features that you may care about when it comes to the decision of buying a car. However, if you really care about your transportation method can help avoid environmental pollution, you may actually should have started your decision frame as whether I should take public transportation method or should I buy a car. The zoom is the very first step you need to figure out before you focusing on the features, because the things outside of your frame may actually have the same, even better feature that may be more beneficial towards your decision. Now we can use this diagram to help us think about the decision problem and to decide what is the best frame to go about for that decision. Okay, again, using the example that I have just described, the problem of buying a car versus the problem of choosing the best transportation method. Well, in the case of the decision choosing which car to buy as the decision frame, in that scenario, it has taken as a given that you will need to drive to work or to school. And what is to be decided now is which car to buy. And then what needs to be decided later is where to park the car and everything that comes after you actually implement the decision. However, if you are thinking about that decision in the frame of whether to take public transportation method or buy a car, then in that case, what's to be decided is a much bigger perspective than the earlier frame. And what's taken as given in this scenario in choosing this frame is that you need to go to work, you need to go to school. Then if you go further back and decide whether to go to work and whether to go to school, that is not a decision that you need to consider right now. You can take that as a given. And then after you decide whether to take transportation, public transportation, or whether to drive to school or work, then you can decide. If you decide to drive to work, then you can decide which car to buy. If you decide to take transportation method, you can decide later which bus route is best for you. Okay. And this is a very helpful diagram to think about any problem. Think about another example where we're looking at home remodel. Okay. The original plan is to remodel your home now that the kids are in college. Now you can rethink about this decision in terms of its frame. Okay, are our housing needs the same as before since now we have one less people in the family? Would we rather buy a new home? Depending on that, you can choose the type of contractor to decide whether the renovations are for personal taste or the renovations are to increase the market value so that you can sell the current home at a higher value. Here, in this thought process, what's taken as given is that you need to remodel the home. You need to remodel the kitchen, you need to build a deck with a hot tub, and you need to repaint the interior. Then, based on what's the thinking, the thought process over here, what's remain to be decided is the choice of interior designer and contractor. That is what you need to decide right now. After you decide which designer to use, then you can choose the fabrics or the colors or the specific little details that you can implement with the innovation. Another interesting example also introduced in the textbook is the matter of perspective. So you're looking at a hotel, a busy hotel, where the customers, the residents complain about the long wait at the elevator. Then if you take the problem to an engineer, then the engineer's proposal is either to make the current elevator runs faster or to build another elevator into the building, both of which are actually very expensive. However, if you jump out of an engineer's frame and if you take it to a psychologist, then the problem is not the actual time that people wait for the elevator, but the idle or the boredom from waiting the elevator. So what could have been done in a much cheaper way to solve the problem is to have a measure or have a TV besides the elevator so people have things to do, or put a plant over there so that people feel the environment is pleasant for the waiting. Then conceptually people find the elevator comes faster. Okay. There are numerous examples in the textbook, which I will not discuss in the recording, but you are encouraged to look at those examples and think about how these examples and these principles can help with your personal decisions in your everyday life. So you can question the frame by asking yourself, what am I taking as given? Am I being too narrow or too broad? Have I considered both the short run and long run consequences? And are there any stakeholders included? Are there any other people that I should talk to so that I can take into consideration of their interests?